The old man had been standing at the gate of the cemetery for 11 minutes before anyone bothered to speak to him, and when the first words finally came, they were not a greeting. "You're going to have to move." It was a raw, colorless morning in late October. Frost still clung to the grass in the low places where the sun hadn't reached, and the long rows of white headstones ran up the hill like teeth, catching a light that had no warmth in it. A flag near the gate hung at half-staff, dead still, waiting for a wind that hadn't decided to arrive. It was the kind of morning that made the living speak in lowered voices, and everywhere across those grounds, people did. Everywhere except at the gate, where a young sergeant in a pressed uniform had planted himself in the old man's path like a fence post. His name tag read Pruitt. He was maybe 24. His shoes were spotless. Before him stood Elias Bishop, 91 years old, though few would have guessed it right, because there was something in the way he held himself that made age difficult to measure, a stillness that could have belonged to a man of 60 or a man of 100. He was thin now, the way old oaks go thin, all the softness burned off, and only the frame left standing. His hands were folded in front of him, spotted and knotted at the knuckles, and they did not fidget. His suit was gray, worn at the elbows, pressed as flat as an iron and a careful hand could make it. It was the only suit he owned, and he had owned it for 30 years. He did not answer the sergeant. He was looking past him, up the hill, to a spot near the crest where a green canopy had been raised over an open grave, and a folding line of chairs waited empty in the cold. "Sir?" Pruitt stepped sideways to block his line of sight, the way you'd heard a stray. "I don't think you heard me. This is a private service, family and invited guests only. There's a public entrance about a mile down the road if you're here to visit someone." "I'm here for General Chandler," Elias said. His voice was quiet and even, and it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than an old man's chest ought to reach. It did not plead. It simply stated a fact, the way a man states his own name. Pruitt exchanged a glance with the corporal standing a few feet behind him, a heavy-set kid named Vega, who had the bored, faintly amused look of someone watching a problem that was about to be somebody else's. Vega snorted. "You and General Chandler," Vega said. "Old friends, huh?" "We were." "Right." Vega folded his arms. "General Marcus Chandler, 4 stars, ran 2 theaters of command, advised 3 presidents, had his own wing named after him at the War College. And you were, what, his golf buddy?" Elias didn't rise to it. He'd been mocked by better men than a bored corporal on a cold morning, and the mockery had never once mattered as much as the men doing it believed it would. He had learned a long time ago that contempt was cheap, that it cost the man giving it nothing, and was worth exactly as much, and that the only sane thing to do with it was to let it fall through you like water through a screen. "I'd just like to pay my respects," he said. "I won't take a seat if there isn't one. I'll stand at the back." "There's no back for you to stand at," Pruitt said, and now his patience, never deep, was audibly running out. "Look, I'm sure you knew somebody who knew somebody. Everybody's got a war story, but I've got a list and you're not on it. And in about 20 minutes, a whole lot of people with a whole lot of stars on their shoulders are going to be coming through this gate, and I am not going to be the guy explaining why there's a man in a thrift store suit wandering around the perimeter. So, do us both a favor." Behind them, up the road, the first of the long black cars had begun to arrive. They came slowly, in the way funeral cars come, their tires whispering on the wet asphalt, government plates, tinted glass. As each one rolled past the gate on its way to the reserved lot, the faces inside turned to look at the small drama playing out on the pavement. The 2 young guards, the frail old man, and each face wore the same expression, a kind of pained, embarrassed pity, the look people give a scene they'd rather not have witnessed. One of them, a woman in a black coat, held her gaze on Elias a half-second longer than the rest, before her car carried her away. Elias felt the eyes. He always did. He had spent a lifetime being looked at that way, and had come, over the decades, almost to prefer it. Because a man nobody takes seriously is a man nobody watches too closely, and there had been long stretches of his life when not being watched too closely was the difference between living and dying. Invisibility had been his craft once, his trade. It fit him better than the suit did. But not today. Today he had come to be seen by exactly one man, and that man was in a flag-draped casket at the top of the hill, and these 2 boys were standing between them. "My name is Elias Bishop," he said. and for the first time, there was the faintest weight behind it, like a stone dropped into a still pond. If you'd send that name up to whoever's in charge, that would be enough. Just the name, Bishop. Pruitt actually laughed. Bishop, sure, and I'm the Secretary of the Army. He stepped in close, closer than he needed to, using the height and the youth of his body, the way a man does when he wants to make another man feel small. I'll tell you what your name is. Your name is Trespasser. You've got no invitation, no ID that means anything here, no ribbons, no uniform, no proof you ever served a day in your life. As far as this gate is concerned, you're a civilian standing where he's not supposed to stand. No proof you ever served. Something moved behind the old man's eyes. Not anger, not yet, just a flicker. A coal shifting under a long, cold layer of ash. His right hand, folded over his left, pressed once against something small pinned to his lapel, a reflex older than thought. He didn't look down at it. He didn't have to. He knew exactly what it was, and exactly what it had cost, and exactly why no man alive had the standing to tell him he'd never served. The commotion had begun to draw a crowd. They gathered the way crowds gather at a funeral, quietly, at a respectful distance, drifting toward the disturbance without seeming to. Generals in dress blues, senators with grave, careful faces, aides and adjutants. A cluster of Chandler family in black, the general's daughter among them, her eyes swollen, watching the scene at the gate with a frown of pure confusion, as if she were trying to place the old man's face and couldn't quite. The whispers moved through them like a current. Who is that? Why won't they just let him? No, security won't. Some poor, confused old fellow, so sad, on a day like today. Into that crowd, drawn by the same instinct that draws every young officer toward a scene where rank is being thrown around, walked a captain named Dana Reyes. She was 31, an intelligence officer with 2 deployments behind her, and a mind that never quite stopped cataloging. She had come to the funeral out of something close to obligation. She had never met General Chandler, but she had read him. Read everything he'd written, in fact, back when she was a lieutenant chewing through every command memoir she could find. And one of those memoirs had stayed with her in a way the others hadn't. It was Chandler's own, published late in his life, a thin and strange book that spent very little time on the campaigns that had made him famous, and an unusual amount of time on a single winter early in his career. On a place. On a coal so total it had become its own country. And on a man. Reyes came around the edge of the crowd just as the sergeant leaned into the old man's face, and she stopped, and she watched, and something began to prickle at the back of her neck. It was the old man's stillness that caught her first. She had learned to read men in rooms where reading men was the entire job, and she knew the difference between the stillness of someone confused and the stillness of someone who had simply decided, long ago, that certain kinds of noise were beneath a response. This was the second kind. This was the stillness of a man standing in a hailstorm he had already survived. Then she saw his hands. Steady. Absolutely steady. A confused 91-year-old's hands did not do that. And then, as the sergeant jabbed a finger toward the old man's chest, she saw what he was jabbing at. A small, dull, misshapen thing, pinned crookedly to the gray lapel. From this distance, it looked like nothing. A cheap old button, tarnished black-brown. The kind of thing you'd find in the bottom of a sewing tin and throw away without a second look. Reyes's mouth went dry. Because she had read about a button, she didn't move yet. She needed to hear more. She drifted a half-step closer, close enough now to hear the young lieutenant who had come striding over from the checkpoint, a sharp-featured officer named Cade Whitlock, gold bars gleaming, the picture of a man who had decided today was the day he'd show what he was made of. "What's the problem here?" Whitlock said. "This individual won't leave, sir," Pruitt reported, snapping into the crisp diction men use when a superior is watching. "Claims he was a friend of the general. No invitation, no credentials. We've asked him 3 times. Whitlock looked Elias over. It took him about a second and a half, and Reyes could watch the verdict form in real time. The worn suit, the scuffed shoes, the age, all of it added up and dismissed in a single dismissive sweep of the eyes. "Sir," Whitlock said, "you are 1 order away from being arrested on federal property. I don't want to do that to a man your age on a morning like this, so I'm going to make it very simple. Turn around, walk back down that road, don't come back. Do that, and we forget this happened." Elias looked at him for a long moment. When he spoke, it wasn't defiance. It was almost gentle, the way you'd correct a child who'd said something he didn't yet understand. "I've walked away from a lot of things in my life, son," he said. "I've walked away from things you'd have nightmares about, but I'm not going to walk away from him, not today. He waited too long for me to show up. I'm not going to be late again." Whitlock's jaw tightened. He had offered the man an exit, and the man had refused it in front of a crowd. And now, the thing had stopped being about a confused old civilian and started being about the lieutenant's pride, which is the most dangerous thing a small man can be handed. "Then you're under arrest," Whitlock said. "Trespassing and disruption of a military ceremony." He jerked his chin at the guards. "Get him out of here. If he resists, cuff him." Pruitt and Vega moved, and as they did, Whitlock's eye caught, as Reyes's had, on the little dark object pinned to the old man's chest. He reached out, a careless, contemptuous flick, and tapped it with one gloved finger. "And take that off him before you put him in the car," he said, sneering. "I don't know what this is supposed to be. A button off some old coat? You think this makes you somebody?" His fingertip touched the metal, and the morning fell away. It is December of 1950, and the world is white and it is trying to kill everyone in it. The cold at the Chosin Reservoir is not weather. It is a presence, a live thing, a Fourth Army on the field that takes no side and takes everyone. It is 35 below zero, and the wind comes off the frozen water and finds every seam in every coat. Rifles won't fire. The oil in them has frozen solid. Blood freezes before it can finish leaving the body. Men who lie down to rest for a moment do not get up. The Marines and soldiers of the column are surrounded, cut off, 10 times outnumbered, ordered to fight their way out through a gauntlet of hills that the enemy owns, in a cold that owns them both. And somewhere in the middle of that frozen column, moving from man to fallen man, is a 20-year-old medic named Elias Bishop. He does not look like much even now, slight, quiet, but the men have started to say a word about him, passing it up and down the line, the way freezing men pass anything that gives them a reason to keep moving. They call him Lazarus, because Bishop goes out into the dark and the white where no one goes, into the ditches and the ravines where the wounded have crawled to die, and Bishop brings them back. Men the column has written off, men marked dead. Bishop finds them under the snow, digs them out, thaws their hands against his own belly, and carries them home on his back. The medics say a man who's gone that cold, that still, doesn't come back. Bishop keeps bringing them back anyway. So, Lazarus. On the third night of the breakout, near a shattered village called Hagaruri, a young lieutenant goes down. His name is Marcus Chandler, and he is 23 years old, and a mortar round has thrown him into a frozen ditch and shattered his leg, and he is bleeding into the snow and going quiet, going still, going that particular kind of peaceful that Bishop has learned to hate more than any scream. The lieutenant's men can't reach him. The fire is too heavy, the ground too open. They can see him out there in the blue dark, a dark shape on the white, getting stiller. Bishop goes. He low crawls out across 40 yards of open, frozen ground with tracers cutting the air a foot above his spine, and he reaches the lieutenant, and he wraps the leg, and he gets a shoulder under him. And as he does, a second round comes in. Bishop hears it, that half-second of warning that combat medics develop like a sixth sense. And he does the only thing there is to do. He throws his own body over the wounded lieutenant, and he takes the ground. The blast fills his back with steel, but the lieutenant lives. Bishop drags himself and the man he is bleeding to keep alive back across those 40 yards, one clawing arm's length at a time, and he does not let go until other hands take the weight. 2 days later, in a freezing aid station that smells of blood and burned diesel, the two of them lie side by side. Bishop's back is a map of shrapnel. Chandler's leg is in a splint that will never sit quite right for the rest of his long, decorated life. And the young lieutenant, drifting on morphine and shame and gratitude too big to hold, reaches down to his own filthy overcoat and, with numb and clumsy fingers, works loose a single brass button. He presses it into Bishop's raw palm and closes the boy's fingers over it. "They're going to give me things for this," Chandler says, and his voice is cracking. "Medals. A promotion, probably. For lying in a ditch while a kid crawled out and got shredded carrying me home. It's not right. None of it's right." He tightens his grip on Bishop's hand. "I don't have anything to give a man like you. The Army doesn't make a medal high enough. So take this. It's off my own coat. It came where I came from, and it's going where you're going. And every time you look at it, you'll know that there's a man walking around this earth who exists because of you. That's all I've got. It's the whole of what I've got. Bishop looks at the button. Ugly, dull, worthless, worth everything. I'll keep it, he says. The vision shattered. Elias was back at the gate. The frost, the headstones, the pressed young lieutenant with his finger still resting on the button. Half a second had passed. To Whitlock, nothing had happened at all. But something had changed in the old man's face. The stillness was still there, but the ash had been swept off the coal, and the coal was lit, and for the first time all morning, the two guards felt it. An old, banked heat. The kind of thing that had once made hardened men step aside without being told. Elias reached up and very gently moved the lieutenant's hand away from his chest. Don't, he said quietly. Touch that. Captain Reyes had heard enough. She turned on her heel and moved fast, out of the crowd, phone already in her hand, but not to the police and not to the officer of the day. She was scrolling for a different number entirely, because she had realized, in the second the lieutenant's finger touched that button, exactly what she was looking at. And she knew that if she tried to explain it to the men at the gate, they would arrest her old man before she got to the second sentence. There was a colonel here today who would understand in 3 words. Colonel Owen Radek had been General Chandler's aide-de-camp for the last 19 years of the general's life, the man who ran his household and his calendar, and, at the end, sat with him in the hospital. If anyone alive knew the story in Chandler's thin, strange memoir, it was Radek. Reyes had met him twice. She had his number from a working group last spring. She had never in her life been so grateful for a business card. She found the crowd's edge, turned her back to it, and pressed the call. Radek. Colonel, this is Captain Dana Reyes. We met at the Readiness Working Group in the spring. I'm at the main gate. I'm sorry to call you like this, today of all days, but I need you to trust me for 30 seconds. A pause, strained, tired. Captain, we're about to start. What is it? There's an old man at the gate. Security's arresting him. 90, 91, gray suit. He says he knew the general. They think he's confused. She took a breath. Sir, he's got a brass button pinned to his lapel. Not a medal, a single old button, off a field coat. And he gave his name as Bishop, Elias Bishop. The line went silent. It was a silence with a texture to it, the kind that fills a room. Reyes could hear faintly the ambient sound of the command post on the other end. A radio, a low voice, the shuffle of paper. And then, one by one, each of those sounds seemed to stop, as if a hand had been raised. When Radek's voice came back, it was not the same voice. Captain, very slow, very careful, like a man afraid of dropping something. Say the name again. Bishop, sir, Elias Bishop. He has the button. Where is he, right now, this second? At the main gate, 2 enlisted and a lieutenant. They're moving to cuff him. She heard, from 100 yards away, the crash of a folding chair going over, and a man's voice, Radek's voice, carrying across the cold grounds even without a phone. Stop the procession! Stop it! Nobody moves! Inside the command tent, Colonel Owen Radek was already moving, and his face had gone the color of the frost outside. For 19 years he had run this man's life, and for nearly all of those 19 years he had watched General Marcus Chandler, a man who had commanded armies, who had stood in rooms with kings, spend his private hours on one thing, not his legacy, not his memoirs, not really. On a search. Find Bishop. Chandler had spent the last 2 decades of his life, and no small part of his fortune, trying to find the medic from the reservoir. He had hired researchers, written to veterans' roles, followed dead ends across 4 states. Because Bishop had done what men like Bishop always do. He'd melted away after the war, taken no medals, given no interviews, wanted no part of being anyone's story. He had simply disappeared back into the ordinary life he'd bled to protect, and he had been very, very good at disappearing. The Army had never even properly recorded what he'd done, because the men who could have testified to it had mostly frozen to death on the road out of Chosin. The general had died without finding him, and in the desk drawer of that command tent, in a sealed envelope that Radek had carried today out of pure sentiment, was the last letter Chandler had written. A set of standing instructions drafted 3 years ago that Radek had promised to honor. Radek's hand shook as he pulled it out and broke the seal, though he already knew, word for word, what it said. If a man named Elias Bishop ever comes looking for me, in my lifetime or after it, you will treat him as you would treat me. You will give him whatever he asks. You will seat him where I would sit. This nation owes him a debt it does not know how to pay and never will. See that it at least remembers his name." Radek grabbed the radio. "Get me General Vance," he said. "Now, off the reviewing stand, off the platform. I don't care what he's in the middle of. Tell him." Radek's voice caught. He steadied it. "Tell him Lazarus is at the gate." General Arthur Vance was the senior officer present that morning. 4 stars, 3 wars, the man they had sent to give the eulogy because there was no one left of higher rank who'd known Chandler as a young man. He was standing beside the flag-draped casket, going over his notes one last time when the young major came at a dead run and put a radio in his hand. Vance listened for 6 seconds. Those who watched him said afterward that they had never seen the man's face do what it did. A hardening and a softening at once, some deep old things surfacing all at once through a lifetime of command. "Say that again," Vance said into the radio, very quietly. The reply came back, and General Vance, who had not run for anything in 20 years, set down the eulogy that he had spent a week writing, turned from the grave of his old friend, and walked fast toward the waiting cars. "Bring the escort," he said to no one and everyone, all of it. Back at the gate, Cade Whitlock was, for a few more seconds, still winning. The old man had refused a lawful order, in front of witnesses, and there were procedures for that, and Whitlock knew every one of them. He had his men, he had his authority. He had restored order to his gate, and if he was honest with himself, he was enjoying it. The way the crowd had gone quiet, the way the moment had bent toward him, he decided he would end it clean. One last word to put the old man in his place for good. He stepped in close. "Here's how this ends, old-timer," he said low, so only Elias and the guards could hear. "You can walk out of here right now with what's left of your dignity, or my men put you in that car, and I charge you, and I write in my report that you were confused, disoriented, possibly a danger to yourself, and they'll believe me, because look at you. You'll spend the general's funeral in a holding room trying to remember what year it is." He let that land, his mouth curled. "You want to say goodbye to your friend? You can do it from a cell." And that was the overreach, the one word too far, because up to that moment, Whitlock had only been a young man being stupid, and there is grace in the world for young men being stupid. But cruelty to a grieving man is a different account, and it comes due. It came due about 4 seconds later. It started as a sound felt before it was heard, a low vibration coming up through the pavement, through the soles of everyone's shoes. Heads turned, and over the crest of the road, moving far too fast for a funeral, came 3 black Suburbans in tight formation, engines climbing, closing the distance to the gate like something with a purpose that would not be argued with. They didn't slow at the gate, they stopped at it, hard. Gravel spitting from under the tires, doors already opening before the vehicles had fully rocked back on their springs. Out of them came the escort, 6 officers in immaculate dress blues, senior men, chests heavy with the weight of long careers, moving with the fast, coordinated silence of people who have been given a single instruction and mean to carry it out. Colonel Radek was first, his face a still mask over something breaking underneath it. And then, from the lead vehicle, unfolding to his full height, came General Arthur Vance, 4 silver stars on each shoulder. The morning seemed to arrange itself around him. The whispers of the crowd cut off all at once, and the little wind that had finally started to move through the headstones seemed to hold its breath. And there was nothing on those grounds in that moment but the sight of a 4-star general looking for one man. Whitlock and his guards snapped to attention out of pure spinal reflex, their hands falling away from the old man as if he'd become electric. Vance did not look at them. His eyes went past the lieutenant, past the guards, past the whole trembling apparatus of the gate, and landed on the stooped figure in the gray suit. And the whole hard architecture of the man's rank came down off his face at once, and what was underneath it was something Reyes, watching, would never forget. Something like awe, and something like grief, and something a great deal like a boy meeting a legend he'd been told about his whole life and never dared believe was real. Vance began to walk toward Elias Bishop. He walked slowly, boots even on the wet pavement, past everyone, and he did not stop until he stood 3 feet in front of the old man. And there, in front of the generals and the senators and the family and the two frozen guards, General Arthur Vance drew himself up ramrod straight and raised his right hand to his brow in the sharpest, most exact salute that anyone standing there had ever seen a man render. A 4-star general, saluting a civilian in a worn gray suit. "Mr. Bishop," Vance said, and his command voice carried clear across the frozen grounds so that every soul there heard it. "It is the honor of my life, sir. If you're still with me, do me one small favor before we get to what General Vance said next. Because what he said is the part I've been wanting to tell you since the beginning. Tap the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people who need to hear stories like Elias Bishop's. And if you believe the ones who did the most are too often the ones we notice the least, hit subscribe and stay with me to the end. Now, let's get back to the gate." Lieutenant Cade Whitlock found his voice, and it came out cracked and small. "General, sir, I apologize for the disturbance. This man wasn't on the list. He had no invitation. He was creating a—" Vance's head turned. He did not lower his salute, but his eyes moved to the lieutenant, and they were the color of the frost, and the look in them stopped Whitlock's sentence in his throat like a hand around it. "He has more right to stand on this ground than every officer at this gate combined," Vance said, "including me." Then he turned slightly, keeping his hand at his brow, and raised his voice so that it reached the whole silent gathered crowd. "For those of you who don't know who you're looking at," the general said, "let me tell you. You see an old man in a cheap suit. I understand. That's what he spent 70 years making sure you'd see. But I am looking at a giant, and before this morning is over, so will you." He let his hand come down at last. "This is Elias Bishop. That name is in no history book. There is no wing of the War College named for him, no statue, no medal on record, and that is not an oversight. That is a choice he made and enforced for 7 decades. But there are men, old men now, most of them gone, who knew him by another name. To the men who broke out of the Chosin Reservoir in the winter of 1950, in a cold that killed more of them than the enemy did, this man had a name that they said the way you'd say a prayer." Vance's voice thickened. "They called him Lazarus because he walked out into that white dark where the dying had crawled, and he brought the dead back home." A sound went through the crowd, a low collective intake of breath. The name meant nothing to most of them, but something in the way the general said it told every person on that hill that they were standing near the edge of something enormous. "He was a medic," Vance went on, 20 years old. He carried men on his back across ground that would freeze the blood in your veins, through fire, one at a time, for 3 nights, and he refused every award the army tried to give him afterward. And then he vanished, because men like Elias Bishop do not do what they do to be seen doing it. Vance took a step closer to the old man, and now there was open water standing in the general's eyes. "And on the 3rd night of that breakout, near a place called Hagaruri, a mortar round put a young lieutenant in a ditch and left him to bleed out in the snow. And this man crawled 40 yards under fire to reach him. And when a 2nd round came in, this man laid his own body over that lieutenant and took the steel that would have killed him." Vance turned to the crowd, and his voice rose and broke and rose again. "That lieutenant lived. He went home. He learned. He led. He rose. He commanded armies and he counseled presidents. And he built a life so large that this entire cemetery turned out this morning to bury him with honors." The general lifted a hand toward the canopy at the top of the hill, toward the flag-draped casket. "That lieutenant was Marcus Chandler. The man we came here to honor is only here to be honored, is only here because of the man you just tried to put in handcuffs at your gate." He turned back and pointed gently at the small, dark object pinned to the old man's chest. "And this thing you called a button off an old coat." Vance's voice dropped to something quiet and terrible. "General Chandler took this off his own overcoat with frozen hands in that aid station and pressed it into this man's bleeding palm. He told him the army didn't make a medal high enough for what he'd done, so he was giving him the only thing he had. General Chandler spent the last 20 years of his life trying to find Elias Bishop. He wrote it into his final orders. He died still looking." Vance's jaw worked. "That man came here today on his own, found his way to this gate on his own, to say goodbye to the friend who never stopped searching for him, and you called him a trespasser." The vindication moved through the crowd, like a wave breaking. The pity was gone from their faces now, wiped clean, replaced by something closer to reverence and something closer to shame, because every one of them had looked at the old man at the gate and seen exactly what the guards had seen, and every one of them knew it. Chandler's daughter had both hands pressed over her mouth. She was staring at Elias as if a photograph she'd known her whole life had just stepped down out of its frame, because she had grown up on the story of Lazarus, the ghost her father talked about at the end of every hard night, the man he could never find, and here he was, real, standing in the frost in a gray suit. And then, near the back, an old retired colonel who had come to bury a friend slowly raised his hand to his brow. Another followed, then a general, then a young private on the honor guard, and a senator's aide who had never worn a uniform in his life and did it anyway. One by one, across the whole slope of that hillside, the living came to attention and saluted the old man at the gate, a forest of raised hands, silent in the cold, until the only 3 people on those grounds not saluting were Lieutenant Cade Whitlock and his 2 guards, who stood white-faced and frozen, understanding for the first time the full size of what they had almost done. General Vance turned his attention to them last, and when he did, his voice dropped out of the parade ground register into something much quieter and much worse. "You asked him for his invitation," Vance said. "Let me help you. Every white stone on that hill is his invitation. Every flag flying at half-staff this morning is his personal welcome home." He took a step, and the 3 of them flinched. "You told him he had no proof he'd served. Lieutenant, this man's back still carries the steel he took, so a boy in a ditch could grow up to be the reason we're all standing here. He wears his proof under his skin, where you'll never have to look at it, which is exactly the way he wanted it." Vance's eyes went hard as stone. "Your job at that gate is not to check a list. A machine can check a list. Your job is judgment. And this morning, handed a living piece of this country's history, you looked at him and saw a nuisance. You mistook a Titan for a trespasser. You will report your names and your unit to my aide before you leave these grounds, and the 3 of you will stand in front of my desk at 0600 tomorrow, and we are going to have a very long conversation about what that uniform is actually for." "Yes, General," the 3 men said, barely above a whisper, and then a weathered hand came to rest on the general's sleeve. It was Elias. "Arthur," the old man said softly, using the general's first name, the way only a man from an older world would dare. "Let it go." Vance looked down at him. "They're kids," Elias said. "They were doing the job the only way anybody ever taught them to do it. I've been made small by men a lot bigger than these 2, and it never once made me any smaller. Don't wreck their lives on my account. That's not why I came." For a moment it looked as if the general might argue. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Because when Lazarus asks you for a man's life, even the small daily life of a foolish young officer, you do not say no." Elias turned, then, to Whitlock, and there was no anger in his face at all, only something worn smooth and deep, like a river stone. "Son," he said, "that uniform doesn't hand you respect. Nobody's does. It's a promise you make every morning and keep or break by supper time, one person at a time, by how you treat the ones who can't do anything for you." He held the young man's eyes. "The most important people you'll ever stand next to won't have a single ribbon on their chest. Some of them will be wearing a cheap gray suit. You remember that? And this'll have been worth it." Whitlock could not speak. His eyes had filled and his careful arrogance had cracked all the way through. And what stood there now was just a young man who understood, finally and completely, what he had almost thrown away. He managed a single word. "Yes, sir." Not "sir" the way you say it to rank. "Sir" the way you say it to a man. General Arthur Vance walked Elias Bishop through the gate himself. He did not lead him to the back. He walked the old man up the long slope of the hill, past the rows of the honored dead, through the standing forest of salutes, all the way to the front row, and he seated Elias among the family, beside Chandler's daughter, who took the old man's spotted hand in both of hers and wept and thanked him, over and over, for the 50 years of her father's life that had been a gift from a boy in the snow. Elias sat through the service quiet and straight, a still gray figure in the front row, and when the rifles cracked their volleys and the bugler played the old sad notes and they folded the flag into its tight triangle, the general's daughter turned and put it in his hands instead of her own, pressed it against his chest, and closed his fingers over it, exactly the way a young lieutenant had once closed his fingers over a brass button in a freezing aid station 70 years before. Elias looked down at the flag for a long moment. Then, very carefully, he unpinned the little tarnished button from his own lapel, and he leaned forward and he set it down on the polished lid of the casket. "There," he said, so quietly that only the front row heard it. "I kept it, Marcus. I told you I would." He rested his hand flat on the wood. "You can have it back now. You held up your end. I finally held up mine." Chandler's daughter reached out and stopped his hand. "No," she said through her tears. "He'd want you to have it. He looked for you for 20 years so he could tell you that himself. Please, keep it. It was always yours." And she pinned it back on the old man's chest, over his heart, where it belonged. The story of the old man at the gate did not stay at the gate. By that evening it had traveled, the way the best stories do, from soldier to soldier, quietly, without a press release. General Vance, true to his word, did not end the careers of the three young men. Elias had asked him not to, and Vance was not in the habit of refusing that man anything. Instead, he did something that outlasted a punishment. He built a thing out of it. Every new soldier who now stands a gate, works a checkpoint, or guards a post at a sensitive installation goes through a short block of training that didn't exist before that October morning. It is not about weapons or protocols. It is about the other thing, about looking past the surface of a man, about the difference between a list and a life, about the terrible cost of contempt handed out cheaply to someone who has already given everything and asks for nothing. The soldiers who teach it don't always know where it came from, but the men who wrote it named it after the old man in the gray suit, and around the force it is known, quietly, as Bishop's Rule. The first, oldest version of it is only one line. It is the line an instructor says on the last day, and then lets sit in the silence. The ones who gave the most are usually the hardest to see. So, look harder. As for Lieutenant Cade Whitlock, he wrote a letter. It took him 3 drafts in 2 weeks, and he almost didn't send it, and then he sent it. He never got a reply, which he understood, and which he told himself was fine, and which was not fine, and which he carried. Then, 4 months later, at a quiet post a long way from Arlington, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, he was crossing the base chapel lot when he saw an old man in a gray suit standing at the low iron fence of the small on-post cemetery, looking at the graves. Whitlock stopped. His heart went sideways in his chest. He almost turned around. Instead, he made himself walk over, and he stood a respectful distance away. And for a while, neither of them said anything at all. The wind moved in the bare trees. "I got your letter," Elias said, without turning. "It was a good letter. Took some spine to write it. I figured a man who'd write it didn't need me to answer it. I figured he needed me to show up." He turned then and looked at the young officer, and there was that small, knowing warmth in the old eyes. "So, how you treating people, son?" Whitlock's throat closed. He got it open with some effort. "Better, sir," he said. "A lot better. Every day. I promise you that." Elias studied him for a moment. Really looked, the way he'd looked at wounded men in the snow to see who was still in there and worth carrying. And whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once, slow, and something in his face eased. "Good," he said. "That's the whole thing. That's all of it." He reached out and, for just a second, gripped the young man's shoulder with one weathered hand, the same grip, though Whitlock would never know it, that had once dragged a bleeding lieutenant 40 yards across the frozen ground. "Stay warm out here. Cold's the thing that gets you in the end. Cold and forgetting to look." And then Elias Bishop turned and walked away across the lot, small and gray and unremarkable, a man nobody would look at twice, the way he had always preferred it. And Lieutenant Cade Whitlock stood at attention behind him and held a salute until the old man was out of sight. Elias Bishop's story is a hard one, and I think it's hard on purpose, because it asks us a question we don't like to answer. How many times have we been the guard at the gate? How many times have we looked at the tired man in the worn coat, the quiet woman nobody introduced, the old-timer holding up the line, and decided, in a second and a half, that we already knew everything we needed to know? The heroes among us almost never announce themselves. The ones who gave the most are, more often than not, exactly the ones we walk right past. Elias spent 70 years making sure the world would underestimate him, and the world happily obliged, right up until a 4-star general stepped out of a car and reminded it what it had almost thrown away. So, look harder. At the gate, in the line, on the bus, in the chair nobody's sitting near. You never know whose back is carrying steel he took so that you could stand here. If Elias Bishop's story moved you, if it made you want to look a little harder at the quiet people around you, then do one thing for me. Hit the like button, because it's the small, free thing that lets stories like this one find the people who need them. Share it with someone who spent their life giving and never once asked to be seen. And subscribe and stay with me, because there are more of these, more forgotten men and women who did the impossible and then walked quietly back into the crowd. And every one of them deserves, at least once, to be pulled back out of the silence and seen. Thank you for watching. And to every Lazarus out there in a gray suit that nobody's looking at, we see you. We're finally learning to look.